My name is Michael W. Dodge. I'm a filmmaker from Hillsboro, Oregon, lifelong lover of film and writer. I just dipped my hand actually into making my own films a number of years ago after my wife went through film school. And I saw how easy it was, relatively speaking. I thought it would be much more unattainable, but we are able to put together a number of films now. And in particular, in this film, I'm dealing with processing the grief of my cousin's death. So this is an intensely personal film for me. I generally tend toward lighter fare, but this was an important part of the grieving process for me.
Okay, thank you for that awesome introduction. With that in mind, I know that one of the first questions that popped into my mind when
Mhm.
I first watched this film and looked through it is, of course, that there had to have been a personal element uh, that had that connection to it, and that there's
Yeah.
like that emotional processing. So, what was some of the catharsis that you wanted or experienced taking place while making the film?
So when my cousin got cancer and then was unable to leave her house, her roommate took care of her. And I don't have any reason to think that there was any romantic attraction between the two of them. But I found that to be so moving that this individual would spend so much of their time basically taking months off from his own job to care for my cousin, somebody who was, not a friend or well, maybe a friend, but not family members, not in a relationship. That to me was so moving that a person would do that, and I thought that I wanted to kind of explore that connection between people, and more importantly, as I myself was grieving, I realized that there's a story in that grieving process. And I saw the logistics of the whole thing as kind of a mechanism for that because it struck me about this tension between the emotional component of dealing with the loss, and then there was still the logistics, the reality. And I felt like that really highlighted kind of some of those differences. And in particular, there's the letter that's read. A lot of that comes right, obviously, from myself, my own feelings, and as I was going through that process, what that meant, both some of the individual anecdotes, but also just generally the emotion that goes through that, and the idea of getting around to it, that we put off saying what we should say until we get around to it. And then, of course, we don't always get the chance. And in particular, when we were kids, I would use the phrase around to it. And my cousin would go cut out a little cardboard to it and hand it to me. Here's your round to it. So that was just another tie-in that was an opportunity to kind of deal with her. And then I had the really fortunate opportunity to work with a talented actress, and I felt like she was able to bring to that role the character. There's hopefully it captured a wide range of emotions, which is another thing that I've discovered in the grieving process, that it's not uniform and it doesn't always follow a plan. So the idea of having a list of things where you're trying to be orderly, it goes against grief because the grief doesn't follow the list.
Yeah, and I thought it was just outside of any questions I could ask. I thought that approach of especially having just someone who is, relatively speaking, a stranger, or at least
Mhm.
not family or not obviously connected in any sort of
Mhm.
intimate way, to still go out of their way to help with that process. And I think you
Mhm.
captured that dichotomy really well of the fact that they're doing such an intensely personal
Mhm.
task and they're helping somebody complete it while also having to go around the hurdle of the fact that a lot of the people that Amanda was calling
Yeah.
didn't know her. They weren't really sure, and it was just as it was seen in the film, just creating these different interactions depending on who the person was. And
one of the themes that we talk a lot about, my wife and I, is the connections between people, and how easy it is to be isolated from others. And I was hoping to show an opportunity for the character to kind of have some degree, we call it closure, but right, try to close the loop a little bit on some of that. And one of the things I found through my own grieving is that it is not always that clear cut and clean. But in filmmaking, we write dialogue that is much more literate than we actually speak. We do a lot of those things to try to clarify the story, to make it a better film, to make the storytelling process cleaner. But I think in real life it's not as clean, and hopefully that evokes, the film evokes some of that in people who've dealt with their own grief, that they can see the truth that's in there, even though I did try to keep it as tight as possible and distill that down. But it's still, obviously, real life is a little bit different. And I've had people, say things that make me think I succeeded a little bit in that. And I want to, credit my cast and crew for that, because certainly they did an outstanding job, and they were able to capture what I had written and what I was thinking.
uh, with that, I was really curious about what your process was for finding the casting crew and what led you to make the decisions you wanted, especially with things like I really liked the choice of going from the perspective that of showing not the dynamic between the roommate and the person that she was helping in the present, but post mortem of
Right.
that, and between not just that structure, but with all of the decision, the reasons and motivations behind you wanted to frame it that way. I was really curious about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I was looking to do is, by putting it in a very confined space, right, is I wanted to give the sense that it was uh, compressing the event and everything. But when we're shooting in that tight space, one of the challenges, right, was to lend it a sense of dynamism. So I actually, we picked our DP, Noah, because he has a steady cam and he has experience with that. So that allowed us to move the camera around a bit more, that I think that made it feel a little bit more dynamic, almost like the viewer was pacing with her throughout that space. And Laura, the actress, she auditioned. I held auditions for that part, and her audition was just absolutely wonderful. I felt like she was able to capture the emotion, and there's a range there. There are some lines which I don't know if I would call them comic, but they're a little bit more lighthearted, like when she's talking to the brother. And then to be able to then bring that emotion, and in the realm of happy accidents, as we were wrapping up our shoot on the second day, she mentioned about crying. And so we were able to get that extreme close up of her tear, which I really didn't, that was not on the shot list. So then I was able to actually tap into some other people that we knew, had a really good set dresser, which helped me convert that apartment. We shot in May, but it looked like Christmas, and so he did fantastic work. So that was it. I felt like the structure of the list, yeah. I remember hearing one time that sometimes it's more powerful, something is off screen, because the viewer is able to put their own personal spirit. So that's why I wanted to have just the door that was cracked open, and not actually really show the deceased, but actually show the ramifications. And then the list, to me, was also another structure that I could use for that, because it gives the viewer some idea of the progression that we're going through. And then, of course, they can see when elements are skipped or done out of order. It shows kind of, show don't tell. It shows the character's mindset of how she's working through and processing this in a nonlinear fashion. So I thought that also, it's like good guideposts to lead us through the film. And then I threw in there some surprise elements as well. So that was the idea, was that the viewer would have that sense of not being completely in control, right? Like I said, it wasn't a linear progression. which is, I think, an important part of it. And then I was really pleased that I was able to find a composer that made some music that I think captured the eerie kind of sense of if you would be home alone with a deceased person is probably not the most comfortable environment. So he was able to, I think, capture that. So I was really lucky to work with some very talented people.
Yeah, I do say the main track for the film I really liked, and
Mhm.
having it play definitely contributed a lot to the atmosphere of just showing of really putting forward that melancholy, and
Mhm.
kind of just allowing the audience, or at least myself, to ride along with the feelings in the room, because
Mhm.
it's one of those things that we've all been in situations where there's something we got to do that we really don't want to.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And in this case, right, there's a certain have to that I think she didn't get. That there was a pressure there, as well as making the final call was a thing that she was putting off. And I felt like the actress really brought that through very well. That sense of being internally conflicted, and that was an important part of it. And there's some parts there where she pauses to deliver a thing where one of the things I like as a storyteller is not necessarily to hang a lampshade on everything. Is I like things to be implied. And so she was able, I think, to with her performance bring out some of the subtleties, the implications that I had written in there.
Yeah, you don't need a lot to say a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. One other like main question I wanted to ask is, how do you want this film to um to stand in relation to the other projects that you've worked on or want to work on in the future?
Um, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought much about. My previous film before this was a short film, but a romantic comedy. But my next film is actually dealing with themes of suicide. So I don't know if there's a real through line there between the two of them. I hope this film. I mean, all my films, but I hope this film touches people in some way that helps them feel more connected to not just their own grief but to each other. And so hopefully this film would stand to show a different side of me, being able to kind of process some of the grief and some of these emotions. Um, Maybe who knows, maybe linked with the next one, I thought, should I do a third one to have a grief trilogy? But that's I hadn't really thought much about where it would stand, other than it is strikingly different than the previous film. So bit of a record scratch there.
Yeah, and anytime you deal with like themes of grief and loss, there's always that, like, tone wise,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that you need to navigate delicately in
Mhm.
whatever like respect
Yeah.
you're approaching it from, and especially of if you as a filmmaker, because I also ask is that in addition to myself being part of the board, I myself am a filmmaker too, and
Yeah.
working on those projects for trying something to approach those darker topics. It's one of those things that it deserves to be addressed, but you don't
Mhm.
want to give the audience whiplash.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the reasons why, when I went through the edit process, a trusted friend of mine said, "Well, you could maybe make it shorter." And I left in a couple of the scenes that I felt were a bit of a tonic for some of the other sadness. That I didn't want it to just be a straight, pure laying down into the depths of those feelings. I wanted there to be a little bit of a relief throughout it. And so hopefully I managed to kind of ride that line well, that the emotion, the pathos still comes through, but it's not maybe as overwhelming or one note. I was hoping to capture a little bit more of a myriad of feelings.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that with the pacing of the film as well,
Mhm.
of definitely having those moments of minor levity,
Yeah.
and moments that are at least like where it's not just a straight down, 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 down. And I think that's also very true to how we as people operate, especially in moments of loss and grief, in that yes, we can
Mhm.
have moments of really of being really, really deeply low. But even sometimes in those moments, they're pockmarked by spaces where they're neutral or people can find small things to find joy in. And
Mhm.
generally, people's emotions and feelings and their states of mind are so dynamic. I would almost say even way more dynamic that could ever be truly
Oh,
100% captured in film. But
yeah.
to approach something akin to it and represent it, I think it's something that this film does really well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've heard that talk about grief that people are shocked when they laugh, but it's part of the author explained as part of being human, and sometimes the humanity of that. And so I tried to capture that in. There's a line about, well, they don't use moving straps because what happens sometimes, right, is we focus on these really minutia details as kind of a way to distance ourselves from the pain, and then it's kind of funny to think like at a weird way that he's the brother's worrying about how they're going to actually move the body out of the room, right?
Yeah.
That's but it is the humanity is part of us being humans where sometimes you ask those questions and you're like, this is ludicrous, why did I do that?
Yeah, and people also, I think, that it's definitely something I myself have experienced personally, but it's also something I think we that can occur a lot in film of what I call the stretcher moment, that
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain threshold where after someone dies or passes away, that some people are really good at internalizing it or
Mm-hmm.
compartmentalizing it until there's a moment, like let's say like a funeral home stops and come by
Yes.
and they pick up the body. The moment the stretcher is out,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, this is happening,
Yeah.
and all of it just comes in, that it just like
Mm-hmm.
comes crashing down. However they were whatever they were holding on to is just like, oh no, it's out. I have to face this right now.
Yeah, the moment it goes from uh, the abstract to the concrete in their own personal experience, and that was another thing too that I just generally like to tell stories that are personal. That's about a person, right? And this was an opportunity really to just have the single character, but it is about her experience and how that lands on her as we go through this. And one of the things again is it's 10, or I guess 12 minutes, but it happens in essence in real time. This is her experience is in those 12 minutes she's going from the person dying to making working through this list, which is probably unrealistic in real life. A person would
Yeah.
take more time, but in film we have to push that through. But that was the idea, was to follow her, and as I mentioned earlier, I hope to have a certain sense of a claustrophobic feeling of it's just, and she's in that, trapped in that space, and she wants to get away from what's happening, but she has to keep going back, and so that whole sense of being trapped in a space, confined in both time and in physical space,
Yep.
raises the pressure on this character, and I guess that kind of brings out the grain, right, in a person, is when you have those pressurized situations.
Yes, and it just narrows and lasers down focus
Mhm.
to what's in front of them. And to also piggyback on that point, it's something I'm not sure if it was intentional. I'm happy to ask if it was intentional. But I also felt with the edit as well that, like you said, it was constrained in space and time. That it almost felt like that there were scenes, of course, with like the cuts that took place in between certain calls or certain moments, and like micro scenes that it almost felt like I, as the audience, did not know how much time had passed
Oh wow.
and how much like, okay, so there was this cut on whether or not, like, the most distinct moment that I
Right.
got was in between phone calls when she's called,
Right.
picks up the phone and is really angry and just immediately jumps into the assumption of that of of who she's calling back or that they're calling back, and has to continue that sort of argument, and just things like, wow, that's jarring, and that I don't know how long she's been sitting there at that desk.
Right.
And
So I wasn't thinking as part of the edit as trying to imply that there was a long period of time. I think that's cool that it felt that way because what the idea behind that was in her mind, there is no real time flow, right? That for her, she's in this bubble. And so there kind of really isn't a through line. So I think I managed to get rid of every all timepieces in the visual imagery. I think I got rid of them all. And the idea is that it wasn't a ticking clock or something where the not like High Noon where the viewer is able to track that. That it was more like I said, this bubble of things. But that's an interesting. That's awesome that you got that out of it because that is not what I intended.
no, but that's good. I mean, is like that's how I felt. It's just like, well,
Yeah,
this is a really interesting take too, because like you said, is that she's
yeah,
in stasis.
yeah.
She is 100% focused on the task at hand
Mhm.
because it's a very unsavory task,
Yeah.
and it's one that like I got to get around to it. And that,
Mhm.
especially like you said, that the phrase and the title of the film of that action, getting around to it, that's something that's not only something that the deceased has to do or had to do,
Yeah.
doing it through their roommate, through Amanda, that now they have to do it too. They have to deal with all of this, and that can be extended that basically everyone involved and everyone connected to it has to get around to it at some point.
Yeah, and I so part of that too was we often say, "Well, I'll get around to that thing that we're going to put off infinitely." And so to me, this was the one thing that we can't put off at a certain point. And how do the people who go on, how do they process it and move through it? And as a person, I think there's a little bit of me in the Amanda character because I would have that kind of list focus. That's one of the ways I process things is, okay, what do I need to accomplish? Let's break it down into tasks and check them off. And so that mindset obviously came from my own mindset. And then I also thought with only showing one side of the conversation, right? That also leaves a gap for people to fill in. Um, we toyed with the idea of doing VO for the other side of the conversation, or having me offset reading dialogue into the phone. And we eventually ended up with just having the actress do it herself with her own pacing, which I think worked out best. I think that was for the right thing. But that also is a case of I feel like when she's responding to the other person talking, it's again out of her control. She's reactive, and that's kind of part of the one of the themes that she has to deal with is all of this is happening to her. Like she had no capability to stop what was happening, and now that it's happened, she has to do all these things. They're just coming down on her, which again for me is I recognize in the grief process. You can have that feeling like I don't really want to do this, but I don't have a choice. I have to start making decisions and making these calls. So that was, I thought, the phone call worked out well that way.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the time that we have.
Great.
So, I guess before I ended the recording, were there any final thoughts or things that you want to tell anybody who watches the film?
I just hope that it touches people and it helps them connect to this human experience.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.